Oh, good afternoon. I want to welcome everybody here to our celebration of the canonization of San Romero de las Américas. So I want to start with a little anecdote. I've been to a lot of conferences and meetings in Latin America and elsewhere about Pope Francis. And one friend of mine from Brazil said, you have to distinguish between the Cardinal Bergoglio of history and the Pope Francis of faith. The first, the Bergoglio of history, was dour, melancholic, and always wore a grim countenance as he traveled by himself on the subways of Buenos Aires. He was reaching the end of his archbishopric, they said. A room was already prepared in the seminary for retirement that probably would have consisted on working on his unfinished dissertation in solitude. Then he was called to Rome for a conclave, and the rest is history. The latter figure, the so-called Pope Francis of faith, emerged on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica with a wide grin and humbly asked for the blessing from the people of God. He wears the grace of the office lightly, but also joyfully, even in the midst of calumny and vilification. I'm just going to coach you, if that's right. Pope Francis even preached on the joy of the gospel at the Canonization Mass on October 14th. He said, and this is interesting because he wrote Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, but he quotes Gaudete in Domine, rejoice in the Lord, Paul VI. This is a little bit of a long quote, but it's worth reading. A heart unburdened by possessions that freely loves the Lord always spreads joy, that joy for which there is so much need today. Paul VI wrote, it is indeed in the midst of their distress that our fellow men and women need to know joy, to hear its song. Quoting from Paul VI. Today, Jesus invites us to return to the source of joy, which is the encounter with him. The courageous choice to risk everything to follow him. The satisfaction of leaving something behind in order to embrace his way. The saints, he said, have traveled this path. So joy for the Pope is never a balm that makes us forget our wounds. It's the camino of prayerful discernment whereby we live through la lucha, the struggle of every day. So it brings me great joy to celebrate the canonization, 38 years after the horrific assassination, 31 years after the first Romero days. We're not going to let ourselves turn Romero into a bobblehead saint. Now that he's an official saint, there's even less reason to place him on a pedestal for mere adulation. He and thousands of Salvadorans gave their blood out of love for Christ and for the justice that Christ wills in the present. So in March 2019, we'll address the theme in our annual Romero Days, belonging, the Church of Romero and the Gangs. And we'll also continue to lend our support to the efforts of Cardinal Gregorio Rosa Chavez and others to see that Romero someday is named the pastoral doctor of the Church. We're here today to recall the witness of two new saints, Paul VI and Archbishop Óscar Romero. And we have a stellar panel. Todd Walatka will speak first. Todd will address the fittingness of canonizing Óscar Romero and Paul VI together. Todd serves as the Assistant Chair for Graduate Studies in the Department of Theology and specializes in contemporary Catholic systematic theology. His research is very wide-ranging. It spans the theological aesthetics of Hans Urs von Balthasar, going into the theology of liberation. So fittingly, in 2017, he published Hans Urs von Balthasar and the Option for the Poor with COA Press about theodramatics in the light of liberation theology. Thank you for being here, Todd. Beloved Father Robert Pelton is going to speak about a dream come true, the canonization of Óscar Romero. As many of you know, Father Bob is Director Emeritus of Latin American and North American Church Concerns. Consider what for others would have been achievements normally realized during one's retirement. Romero Days started just 7 years after the assassination when he was 66 years old. He has attended, if not organized, the annual Notre Dame Romero conferences every year since 1987. In 2004, at the tender sapling age of 83, he published Romero, Bishop for a Third Millennium with Notre Dame Press. In 2006, at the age of 85, he published Archbishop Romero, Martyr and Prophet for a New Millennium. Well, about doesn't think in centuries. Millennia is what it counts. 2012, 91, he got the Latin American Studies Association Award for his film, which some of you saw today, Monsignor, The Last Journey of Óscar Romero. 2015, he edited another book, Archbishop Romero and Spiritual Leadership in the Modern World. 2016, the Notre Dame Club, St. Joseph's Valley, gave him the award of the year. 2015, 2016 at 95, honorary doctorate from University of Portland. And this year, the Pièce de Résistance, October 14, 2018, her friend Victor Monica made the trip to Rome for the canonization. Thank you very much, Father Bob. Finally, making her debut performance at the University of Notre Dame, I want to introduce Dr. Carmen Nanko-Fernández, who will present Cese la Represión, Romero, an inconvenient saint for our troubled times. She's an ordinary professor at our sister institution, the Catholic Theological Union in Hyde Park in Chicago. She's the author of a fabulous book, which I've read in many of my classes here, Theologizing in Spanglish, Context, Community, and Ministry with Orbis in 2010. She's a leading Latino theologian whose scholarship focuses in many areas of Latino theology, Catholic social teaching, interreligious, ecumenical, and intercultural relations, sport and theology, and the intersection between faith and popular culture. She has lectured in many places, and finally, it's great that we finally brought her to Notre Dame, including the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, which allows me to introduce her forthcoming book, which is about the true saint of my childhood, El Santo, Baseball and the Canonization of Roberto Clemente. The Religion Sports Series of Mercer Press. With Gary Ribes, she's working on a book series, Disruptive Cartographers, Remapping Theology of Latino-Mente. And she's a past president of the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians in the United States. And fittingly, for us here, in 2012, she received the Virgil Elizondo Award for Distinguished Achievement in Theology. Thank you very much for being here, Carmen. So without further ado, I'll hand the podium over to Todd.
Thank you, Peter. So this afternoon, I'm going to say a little bit about, as the title of my talk suggests, the canonization of Óscar Romero and Paul VI, and sort of how we can understand these together. I'm going to mainly focus in on the influence of Paul VI on Romero. So it's going to sort of be a Romero-centered talk, but trying to see why is it fitting from the perspective of Romero's witness that this canonization happened alongside Paul VI. So the canonization of Romero certainly is a cause for great celebration. One of the most inspiring and courageous witnesses to the gospel in our time has officially been recognized as such by the institutional church. But this event also presents a duty to make sure that Romero is remembered rightly. As with every saint, Romero's witness and legacy are liable to be misunderstood, misinterpreted, whether consciously or unconsciously. So we must ever return to a very basic question. Who was Romero? Many answers could be given to this question. If you go read, the news over the last few weeks, you'll get many different depictions of who Romero was. And here I'll suggest sort of 5 basic answers. Who was Romero? He was a bishop that was close to his people. And he saw his episcopal mission in terms of service to his people. This relationship was so close that he once declared near the end of his life that if he were killed, he would rise up in the Salvadoran people. So Romero as close to his people. Second, he was a martyr for his defense of the poor. He lived and died for the sake of the lives of the poor, and he was a prophet who offered a vision of the church as uncompromisingly committed to the poor. He once declared, it's actually on the back of the Romero shirts if you want to see this, amending an ancient idea from Irenaeus of Lyon. Irenaeus said that the glory of God is the human person alive. Romero said that the glory of God is the poor person alive. Gloria Dei vivens pauper. Third, Romero was a man of deep prayer and trust in God. He frequently spent long nights in prayer in anticipation of major decisions and in preparation for his homilies each Sunday. He encouraged the practice of prayer again and again as a means to maintain an authentic Christian spirit in the world. Fourth, he was also a bishop influenced by liberation theology. Perhaps this statement is a bit more controversial, but I would humbly suggest it is undeniably true. Without losing his critical voice against any reduction of the gospel to politics, Romero was greatly influenced by figures like Echeverria and Sobrino. And finally, Romero was a bishop who was devoted to the Pope and the social teachings of the Church. Given the canonizations of Romero and Paul VI together, what I want to do this afternoon is offer a brief reflection on this fifth theme, on the influence of Paul VI on Romero's theological and ecclesial vision. I'm not going to argue that out of these five or whichever other ones we'd want to add to the question of who is Romero, I'm not going to argue that this is necessarily the most important or even the most instructive way to understand Romero. It's certainly indispensable, I'll argue that, but I'm not actually sure how to differentiate any of these five ways of seeing Romero. One of the beauties of his witness is the way in which he breaks out of so many of the dichotomies that we tend to have in the church, and he brings together many different emphases that we tend to see quite distant and apart. For those who only know the basic narrative of Romero's life and witness, it's usually quite surprising to discover Romero's deep reverence for the teachings of Paul VI. I will try to give you a sense of this by making a few overarching points regarding Romero's writings and then looking more closely at two of his homilies. It's first instructive to look at the text Romero draws upon within his homilies and pastoral letters. So we have 4 pastoral letters, we have 6 volumes of homilies, and other addresses that he's given. And if you look at the first 2 years of his time as Archbishop, only the Bible and the documents of Vatican II are referenced more than the works of Paul VI. Right there with it would be Medellin, but it's basically Vatican II, okay, the Bible, Vatican II, Paul VI. Paul VI's writings are only supplanted after the meeting of Latin American bishops at Puebla in January of '79. And after this point, Puebla surpasses all other ecclesiastical texts, although you still see Paul VI referenced throughout. But basically after Puebla, we see Romero's kind of imagination, the text he's going to continually appeal to become the texts of Puebla. Now, beyond recognizing the sheer number of references, just simply saying he referenced Paul VI this many times, it's crucial to recognize when and what Romero appealed to in the writings of Paul VI. Romero was most likely to appeal to Paul VI in those times when he was exploring the fundamental contours of the mission of the church, and in particular, the question of the concrete mission of the church in the contemporary world. And here he found great insights and guidance in Paul VI's apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Nuntiandi. Romero describes this exhortation as the Magna Carta on evangelization, and he turns to it again and again when defending his vision of the church, his vision for the church in El Salvador, and the need for the church to attend to the temporal needs of society. When Romero is sort of under attack and he's defending himself, he routinely falls back on a fairly kind of, he falls back on a common argument that he makes again and again. He says, I am being faithful to Vatican II, and particularly Vatican II as it's been interpreted through Medellin and through Paul VI. And so he says, I'm faithful to Vatican II. I'm faithful to Medellin. I'm faithful to Paul VI. And sometimes he'll even more polemically turn and say, and my opponents are not. And he'll kind of work through that. So he continually defends himself when he is saying, why do I have this basic vision for the church? What am I, in a fundamental way, trying to do in San Salvador? What am I doing? I'm trying to carry out Vatican II, Medellin, and Paul VI. And very much, I would argue, you see him reading Vatican II through the lens of Paul VI and through the lens of Medellin. So he's sort of looking back at the council through the lens of these later texts. So this is sort of just a very general point, that when you attend to Romero's homilies, his pastoral letters, and you read enough of them, you notice that again and again, when he's doing sort of fundamental ecclesiology, what is the church? What is the mission of the church? What is the church supposed to be doing in our time? he very regularly turns to Paul VI, and particularly Paul VI's reflections on evangelization. Now, two concrete examples. Perhaps the single most striking place that one can see Romero's appeal to Paul VI is in his homily at the funeral mass of Father Rutilio Grande in February of '77. I'm going to assume we know the basic history of Romero and the impact of the death of Grande. When he sees his friend martyred, this had this incredible impact on his journey and his time as Archbishop. And he says at the opening of this homily that he would love to just reflect on his friend and on his friendship with Grande. But he says instead, in the presence of the bodies of the dead, he's going to proclaim a message for all those who continue in the pilgrimage of life. And he says that the major theme of his homily is the following. He says, Paul VI's account of authentic evangelization in Evangelii Nuntiandi provides us with the guidelines for understanding Rutilio Grande. This is one of the most striking and just odd lines I would imagine that I found in one of these homilies. You know, it's one of his best friends who has been martyred, and he says, for this homily, I'm going to reflect upon an apostolic exhortation from the Pope and what it means for evangelization. And this is exactly what he does. Each part of the homily is framed by a particular passage from Evangelii Nuntiandi, and each major point that Romero makes is drawn directly from the Pope's exhortation. Romero finds in Evangelii Nuntiandi a vision of the mission of the Church, which defends human dignity and seeks the transformation of social reality, but without reducing Christian salvation to social justice alone. He finds a vision of social engagement that is deeply inspired by Christian love, that seeks true peace and reconciliation against all that is driven by hatred and love of violence. He finds a powerful defense of the social doctrine of the Church as fundamental to the mission of the Church, rather than standing at the periphery. And he describes Grande as someone who was killed for enacting this vision within the concrete reality of El Salvador. Grande, he says, is someone who was inspired by the faith and motivated by love to seek true peace within a world marked by sin and conflict. Romero then concludes his reflections with, I think, a crucially important point. It would be wrong to see Grande as merely the application of already well-defined ideas. Instead, Grande, by means of his life and witness, helps us to understand the true dimensions of our mission as church. Grande is seen here as a profound teacher of the gospel, incarnating a genuine and expansive Catholic understanding of the church and its mission. In other words, Romero is trying to say something like this. If you want to understand Rutilio Grande, go read Paul VI on evangelization. And if you want to understand Paul VI on evangelization, go look at the life of Rutilio Grande. A second example. In June of 1978, Óscar Romero arrived in Rome to meet with the head of the Congregation for Bishops and Paul VI. This was no ordinary trip. So he had been bishop now for about 15 months. Much news from El Salvador had come to the attention of the church leaders in Rome. Some of it in strong support of Romero, but much of it highly critical of his vision of the church and its mission. Most alarming for Romero, the papal nuncio in El Salvador, a few of Romero's fellow bishops, and key members of the Salvadoran elite had raised serious concerns regarding his leadership. He had been accused of being radicalized by a handful of priests after the death of Grande, of creating disunity in the church, of an unwillingness to cooperate with the government, of engaging in politics within his homilies, and in general of leading the church in El Salvador astray. His fellow bishops had gone so far as to request his removal as archbishop. After a somewhat tense meeting with the head of the Congregation for Bishops, Romero had his meeting with Paul VI. Romero came away from the meeting strengthened and reassured. He says that Paul VI spoke words of encouragement and understanding and made me the messenger of his great pastoral affection for our people. As with the previous meeting with Paul VI the year earlier, Romero was told to remain patient and courageous, to continue to serve his people in the cause of peace against all hatred and violence. Romero reports that the Pope described the Salvadoran people as a people who fights for their rights and seek a more just social order. And the Pope says they are a people who must be loved and helped. And then he encouraged Romero, be patient, be strong, and help them, and tell them that the Pope loves them and cares for them and is aware of what they're going through. Upon returning to El Salvador, Romero prepared a homily that reflected upon his meeting with Paul VI. He actually entitled the homily, "The Pope, the Heart of the Church." That Sunday, he proclaimed the following to the hundreds in the cathedral and the thousands listening on the radio. "Those in Rome could not doubt my fidelity to the Pope, and I have affirmed once again that, God willing, I will die faithful to Peter's successor, the Vicar of Christ. I told them that it is easy to preach the Pope's teaching theoretically. To follow his magisterium faithfully in theory is very easy. But when it comes to living, when it comes to embodying when it comes to making those salutary teachings reality in the history of a suffering people, that is when conflict arises. It is not that I have been unfaithful, never. To the contrary, I feel that today I am more faithful than ever because I experience the testing, the suffering, and the intimate joy of proclaiming a doctrine that I've always believed and loved. And I proclaim it not just with words and lip service, but I'm trying to make it come alive in this community the Lord has entrusted to me." This passage reflects well much of Romero's self-understanding, much of his defense of his ministry, and much of his reading of Grande, actually, in the earlier homily, that Grande was actually putting into flesh, putting into action the teaching of the church. And that's going to, in the midst of suffering and conflict, that's going to bring about a reaction. After this, Romero structures his homily on 3 basic points: the Pope as holy, a man of God, one worthy of Christ; the Pope as a prophet sent by Christ; and the Pope as a sacrament, the visible presence of the divine life that God wishes to give us for our own happiness. Some of what he unpacks then in the rest of the homily is a reflection on sort of basic Catholic ecclesiology in terms of the papacy. But most of it is his own kind of response to Paul VI and the holiness he discerned in Paul VI and the support he felt. So I've tried here to just give us an overarching sense of the influence of Paul VI on Romero and kind of these 2 moments where we see that influence quite starkly. I want to conclude then with just a reflection on Romero's episcopal motto. So the motto he took up when he became bishop was "Sentire cum Ecclesia," to feel or to think with the church. I think this is a wonderful way to understand Romero's witness. Perhaps first and foremost here, following Vatican II, we should understand church here to mean the whole people of God. This would certainly be fair. This would certainly be a fair interpretation in light of how Romero carried out his ministry as Archbishop. He was with the people of God, particularly the poor, learning and living and teaching. His motto also points to the fittingness of his canonization alongside Paul VI. It highlights Romero's deep commitment to maintaining communion with the universal church. And in particular, it draws our attention to how Romero saw Paul VI as a great witness to the gospel, a teacher for the church, and a defender of Romero's pastoral ministry. Thank you.
I'm going to make my expression more on inner experience of 1 week in Rome. I would like to just do a little informal entry into that. One thing I'd like to point out that when I came here in 1939 as a lay student, thinking somewhat about the possibility of priesthood, that I found myself in a French boarding school in northern Indiana. It was a place that best compared with West Point of the United States of America. Now, maybe we needed that. I don't know. All I can say is it was a big surprise for me, coming from a little bit of freedom in northern suburbs of Chicago. Secondly, I just love to compete in swimming, and had done quite a bit of that in Chicago. Not too bad, but passable. and at the same time, so a few of us felt the same way, so we just, on our own, formed a club of swimmers to go around with minimum expense to North Central, to Western Michigan, to the University of Chicago, and compete against varsity teams. And once in a while, we made some points. Not bad for a bunch of kids. Then when I came back from doctoral studies in Rome, many years later, we figured that we had a group of about 40 students at Notre Dame that could have easily gone to other universities and been prime swimmers, particularly youngsters from Fenwick in Chicago, New Trier High School, northern suburbs, Chicago. And so for these were youngsters that couldn't figure out, why does this university have a swimming team? What's going on here? So for 5 years, they set their own plans, their own discipline, and what reply we would get from higher ups would be, well, we don't have the money. Well, I think that may have been true, but you can search for money if you've got something that's worthwhile. And it took us 5 years until they presented it to the administration of Notre Dame, and they said, we want it. It led into varsity swimming for men and women, and also to the Rolf's Aquarium, which will stand up with all of them. And there we were. And one of the people that was successful is our guest, Frank Dinger. Frank and I, oh my God, Frank was in my hall too. So was his brother. But we did the second thing, and then Frank became from club to varsity. He's representing all those people out there, and we were a bunch of arrogant kids that pushed the administration and were successful. And I would say that we are Notre Dame. The second thing I'd like to just repeat back briefly on is West Point. West Point, man. Ooh. You know, you get these old graduates. Yeah, we've got them. Tom Sullivan sitting back there, and they thought, you know, when they get their reunions, they say, "Gee, they were great rectors. They were just wonderful. All the way they walked with you, had to deal with Black Mac. They knew how to do it, all that type of thing." We were kind of tough people, and we were just doing what we were instructed to do. And maybe that's what Notre Dame needed in order to become better, when women were accepted and when we gradually changed the approach to things, which still is demanding, but it's been humanized, and it's something we can be proud of. And we have a group of Notre Dame people from that old time that established their homes and residences in the Notre Dame area because of the fact they want to keep up the contacts, the educational occasions that come up from the three educational institutions here. And they really commit to the community, and they are good and great contributors. That's moving. So, Tom, you're just one, but you're one of many. So let's give you old timers congratulations. So finally, the conclusion was that with Coach Dennis Stark and myself and about 40 dingers, We became varsity at Notre Dame, and we're proud to be that. And it was a great moment to have lived through. Okay, let's get real about what happened in Rome just last week. People would tend to think that that this was just some sudden contact that this university had with the Church of Latin America. It's had an extended and deep relationship with Latin America. In 1960, when I was a young priest, that Montini came here, Paul VI, and he was from Milano. He was talked of as a comer, a very bright leader, and a person that was close to Hesbury. So he comes to town, and he was well received by the faculty at Notre Dame. Two of us, myself from chair of theology, and Paul Buechner, Father Paul Buechner, as dean of the graduate school, were asked to be his subdeacons. So there we have, we're shaking the hand, you know. But also what was important at that time was the fact that this made a great contact with the Italian community within Notre Dame. And Paul VI, he was not quite as flamboyant as Julia Roberts of fame of the earlier film. First of all, he was kind of a shy person, extremely bright, usually wanted to reach out for what could be. And then what happened was when he came and saw that there were Italian faculty members here, he really loosened up. and there was Montini on the floor of the Italian families playing with the kids. God, it was wonderful, beautiful. He said, kind of turned the light on, you know, beautiful, good. And so we had that relationship that began. I just happened to become aware that even of talking about inter-American relations, that that even when we were asked to go down to Santiago, Chile in the early 40s, that it was Cardinal Hera who led us down there, and we thought, wow, guys, we're probably getting to some junior college or something, and we'll do our best. And we got down there, and we found certainly a warm and welcoming people, but at the same time, what happened, it became a breaking open for the Congregation of Holy Cross in regard to Latin America. That relationship still remains strong. Relationships always call for review, and so does ours. But we're working with Chile. Folksley and others and yourself, we're with you. And I hope you're with us, because both of us are being challenged. We know that. But we shall overcome. The Kellogg Institute here at Notre Dame throughout the years has been very committed to the Latin American, particularly Chile and Brazil. And at the same time, the Kellogg Institute and the Department of Theology have always opened the door to this type of interrelationship. And I would wish and hope and pray that we can deepen that even more than it is. This thing has been all opened up strongly because of what's happened with the canonization of Óscar Romero. What's happened to us, the Congregation of Holy Cross and of Notre Dame, is the fact that there can be another type of church which is related, as Romero was, to a church committed to Vatican II and constantly reviewing itself and not being afraid. We've learned that. We've learned that if you take the mid-60s of Latin America in regard to Chile, Brazil, they were the models. They became people of hope for us. We're going to restore that hope. We're going to continue it, develop it deeper. I'd like to talk a bit now about this whole rite of canonization, what happened kind of in concrete ways. And first of all, I'd had with me a person, Victor Maki. Victor Maki is a PhD from Notre Dame. He's an Indian. His first language is Quechua, then Spanish, English, French. He worked hard for his doctorate, finishing up last year, and now has beginning but opening and hopeful contact on the faculty at the University of Purdue, which is not too far from here. But whenever I travel, I have to deal with a medical team. And that medical team always tells me that I have to have somebody with me. So when I take the last fall, that they can pick me up. And that person was Victor Maki. And Victor Maki and I, we've done it. We've done it. We did it in Cuba at the invitation of the Cuban government and of the Catholic Church to show our documentary in the whole country. We've done that in France, which came to us and asked for a year's authorization to use our documentary in all languages of French throughout the world. We've done it. We've been down to Chile Lindo, Alberto Hurtado University. We've been down to most of the Central American countries, and we've been there. We have the feel for it. We know what we can be and what God wants us to be and what we are not at the moment. So on October the 14th at 10 a.m., being present in Rome for the canonization of Archbishop Óscar Romero and Paul VI, along with the other candidates. There they were the banners with the two in the central part and concelebrants, etc. For Romero would be in one part, and Paul VI people with the other part, and then the multitude. How many people? 70,000. Now this is, excuse me, please, this is not political. This is not a Trump figure. But it was like a Notre Dame football game. It was between 70 and 80. And actually, what took place is I have this hero of my companion who pushes me around back and forth on those bricks in front of St. Peter's. There we go. And as we did that, my good friend, Victor, it was like the guy had some power, you know. is we'd be moving into the crowd, and the waters would kind of scripture, just separate, and move through. And then great paisanos there. Great, man. I don't know. I did my doctoral years in Rome, and God, they were so wonderful. A group of paisanos would see us having to move that chair up to the next level. We had 8 of them there. They just lift it up, put it there. And great people. Great people. So we did that, and that was a workout. That was 10 o'clock in the morning, and they took us up. Every person who was there to get into this select section had to be certified by the diocese, which they represented. We were pilgrims from San Salvador, and we had to go through a whole process. Practically ask you for your baptismal certificate, right straight through, and have it all done by the 31st of August. Brescia, which is a diocese where Paul VI came from, that had to be in by the 7th of September. They were avoiding tourist agencies and so forth. They saying, if you're going to be there, this is something serious. And we wanted to take part of it seriously. And we did. And so we go in there, and all the pomp and circumstance. And at first I tended to be a little critical. I thought, well, where's the Latinitas here? Because 3 years ago at the beatification, it was like a mass in the suburb of Rome, rather than taking advantage. But they were to take advantage the following day, the Monday, a week ago Monday, when they had the special liturgy for the pilgrims of Óscar. And that's when the papal nuncio, where they have that big audience room where you can receive people. I'd say there's 2/3 full. Many of them Salvadorans, many of them from Spain, France, Germany, and above all, perhaps the largest foreign group from England. Very impressive. And so there we were. We were in the midst of that. And it was during that ceremony that it was moving. But what they found out with me, they had an overflow of priests. You had to bring your help and stolen, all that sort of thing. We got in there, and they said, well, we can't take you up all the way. There's too many priests. So they took me down. Beautiful. They took me down right among the cripples. And that's where certainly Romero would have chosen. So I figured that, why not? So I pull out the stole, wave it, and they cheer. Because they knew that there was a priest in their midst, just like Romero was in their midst during their lifetimes. Real stuff. Moving. But we should, with due respect, briefly mention the other folks who were brought to the altar and say a word or two, and then move on a little bit more. And there were, of course, along with Paul VI, Óscar Romero, Father Francesco Spinelli, and Father Vincenzo Romano, both diocesan priests, Italianos. Okay, good stuff. Then they were followed by 2 women of religious orders, Maria Catalina Casper. I'm just wondering, she's German, just wondering whether she was friend of Cardinal Casper. Mm-hmm. It's the same name, big name in Germany. But there she was. And she'd been one of these, Teresa of Avila, moved all over the world and got places going everywhere. And the other was Nazaria Ignacia di Santa Teresa, founder of the Congregation, Missionary Crusades of the Church. And finally, they get in there, this young Nuncio Sulpicio, a layperson, young, I think, but he was about 19, I guess, or 20. And they get him in there. And here, finally, they get the lady in there. Great stuff, huh? But he's there. And he's young. And it's kind of a symbol of what this stumbling church is trying to discern right now. How can we open doors wider than we're doing for young people? You do that yourself in your own work. Okay. So that was extraordinary. So that goes on for 2 hours, which is kind of a normal period. And it is a time that really, I think everybody there was called into deep prayer. It's almost, you talk about communion or forming community. There were 70,000 people. Man, we were, you say, go Irish. Man, we were a much better Notre Dame football game. We were moving in the same direction. We knew we were called. And for us, that was just uplifting. Never forget it. But I'd like to say just a word briefly, if I may, about the gospel itself. The gospel itself, as perhaps you might recall, for that day was Mark, and it had to do with the calling of the affluent young man. And the way Francisco, whatever you want to call him, the way he developed that was extraordinary, because you had the sense that that applies to all of us. It's not just some 4-year-old youngster, but each person who takes the gospel seriously is called to a real commitment. Deep, serious, with strong implications. So it wasn't just a wave to the young man, tough you couldn't come along, but it was a call to action. And that's being directed toward the University of Notre Dame. We received a special call on that day last week. And then the next day, when they got together, the folks of the supporters of Romero, they wanted to have a special liturgy for him. And you had all these extranjeros as foreigners coming in who were committed to Romero. Above all, God bless them, the British. And maybe your friend, my friend, Julian Filikowski, a man, he was leading the charge. And Julian Filikowski went there to El Salvador as a Cambridge graduate student, and he had supported the reality of Romero throughout the years. And so we have cooperated, and I'm sure that there is a continuing cooperation that's going to take place with the English Church and with Filikowski. Terrific person. Example of a lay person who can do it, can make it, can follow through. It just moves you. Yeah. So we get there, and this is the day when we could loosen up and have a little bit of Latina stuff. We did, of course. They're there, so they move it, and they act accordingly. And what happened then, of course, it was the president of the conference who celebrated, and then the Cardinal Rosa Chavez, who the Cardinal had been named unexpectedly by Francisco. And he saw me and he saw Victor in this chair in the midst of the sea of faithful. And so he came over to us and he said, I want to thank you at Notre Dame for being with us since 1957 every year. And we thank you too, because you're interested in promoting the role of Romero in the International Church. So at the end of the liturgy, what took place was that the president of the conference from El San Salvador said, "This is a request that we make of you, Francisco. This is what we're asking you to do. We want you to name Romero as a pastoral doctor of the Universal Church. We want you to do that if you will." That's the conference's request. That's the normal way they would do things. And the second part of it was that let's put a little hustle into moving along Rogelio, the young Jesuit who had picked up so well on the practice of pastoral theology among the people that he learned from Quito Pastoral Institute, and who therefore also influenced Romero in another way. So they got both of them in there, and wow. And that was Monday, a week ago Monday. Then we picked up a flight which included the following day early, I guess it was, the flight itself was 18 hours. Then we had a few little couples of stuff in there. And I think it took me till yesterday to kind of get back to South Bend. But here I am. So when you've gone through an experience like that, when we went through that experience, you have a tendency, you want to shout out, want to wake up folk, you want to say that we got something good news here. Let's act on it. And so I felt like shouting out, Saint Romero, Bishop of the world, pray for us. So I'm going to suggest that you join me now in saying, Saint Romero, Bishop of the Church, pray for us. Amen.
Amen. Well, I too have crossed a time zone coming from Chicago, so I know maybe.
We actually got to get together during the show, so sing
like
that song. Chicago, Chicago. Maybe we ought to listen up.
I know, but I'm from the Bronx, so it's not really my song.
Got me.
But buenas tardes. And greetings from the largest Catholic theological school in Chicago without a football team. I am grateful for the invitation by mi compadre, Peter Casarella, director of LANACC, to spend time with Robert Pelton and Todd Walatka, celebrating the canonization of Óscar Romero y Galames. It is a privilege to honor the memory of Romero, un santo popular, sanctified by su gente, at the moment of his martyrdom in San Salvador 38 years ago, and now, finally, formally recognized as a saint of the Universal Church. Unfortunately, the political community is not always organized, and today our people are living in a time of crisis and seeking a new way of life so that they can move beyond the shameful times which we presently experience and form a new society and a new people. These are not my words, nor were they written about our contemporary national situation, though the relevance is striking. Almost 40 years ago, these were the words of Romero in a homily in the same week of the liturgical cycle that we find ourselves in today, reflecting on the same readings that Catholics and other Christians who share the revised lectionary will hear on Sunday. The signs of our own shameful times indicate that we are too in need of creating new ways of living together, new ways of speaking about each other, new ways of belonging. What does a martyr from the 20th century have to say, let alone to a nation indirectly implicated in the very suffering he challenged to his death. What does a bishop have to say to a church reeling from the ecclesial scandal caused by his brother bishops, a crisis whose magnitude mutes the credibility of any prophetic voice on the justice issues of our day? What disruption might this inconvenienced saint stir as a caravan of thousands of refugees moves north, the proverbial pollos coming home to roost, almost 2 centuries after misguided foreign policies, exploitative business practices, and colonizing military interventions? Commemorating the canonization of the martyred bishop of Nuestra América in Estados Unidos might prove to be a source of profound discomfort than fiesta. From my perspective as a Latino theologian, I raised for our consideration this afternoon en conjunto 3 distinct intersecting points where Romero's legacy stands to disrupt and discomfort our sensibility in the USA as a nation and as church in these our shameful times. First, by troubling consciences. Second, by theologizing the daily. And finally, by learning from the street. Romero, troubling consciences. In a certain sense, I was traditioned into Romero by Raúl Julia. His haunting interpretation of the martyred archbishop in the film Romero was a staple of the course I taught for years in an all-boys Catholic high school in the Archdiocese of Washington. To this day, Julia's imploring, "I beg you, I order you, stop the repression," echoes in my mind. So much so that when I finally heard Romero say it in his own voice, I thought, this must be a mistake. Where is the fury? Where is the fire? Where was the passion? The poetic license exercised in the film was necessary to capture almost 3 years of weekly 80 to 90-minute long Sunday sermons, many over 20 pages single-spaced, exhorting, imploring, begging all the Salvadoran people to turn away from violence. As Bob Pelton and others have noted over the years, those words near the end of Romero's last Sunday homily, the day before he was assassinated, are among his most famous, followed by almost 30 seconds of applause in the cathedral. In the name of God, and in the name of this suffering people, who laments rise to heaven each day more tumultuous, I beg you, I beseech you, I order you in the name of God, stop the repression. The context of this order from a higher authority are a response to a letter sent earlier by soldiers seeking Romero's support in publicizing their situation. In a January 1980 homily, Romero read aloud from their letter, which listed 10 requests to improve conditions for the troops. Half of the list included the usual, expected items like better food and better clothing, economic concerns like fair pay, compensated lodging, and improved life insurance. The other requests, interspersed throughout the list, dealt with violence. The soldiers called for a cessation of the beatings that they experienced, of the commands given to them to repress their own people, of combat without any reasons. They outed their commanders and officials as responsible for toda la opresión hecha al pueblo. Lastly, they issued a call for solidarity. We call upon people in general, workers, campesinos, students, and popular and revolutionary organizations to support us in our struggle to achieve better conditions. And at the same time, we accept the responsibility as troops to create an armed forces that protects and defends the interests of the people and not the rich, as is being done in this present time. Romero responded twice, once in the middle of the list when applause greeted the request that soldiers not be forced to repress their own people. Dear soldiers, as you listen to the applause of the people, you find hands extended to you in your time of anguish. At the end of the letter, Romero simply and enigmatically says, "My commentary on all of this can be summed up with the following words: light comes from those who are humble." Again in February, Romero referenced the military in his preaching. "I am not against the institution of the armed forces. I continue to believe that there are honest elements among them. Nevertheless, I cannot be in agreement with those members of the military who abuse their rank and cause us to have less esteem for these necessary institutions that they have converted into the instruments of repression and injustice." Faced with the prospect of fratricide, some soldiers had sought the counsel of their archbishop through their letter. And finally, in March, came their answer with a clarity that was not evident in the January response. Through his last Sunday homily, Romero replied to his people in the armed forces, to the police and the National Guard. "Brothers, you are part of your own people. You kill your own campesinos, your brothers and your sisters." Then Romero reminded them, "No soldier is obliged to obey an order against the law of God. No one has to follow an immoral law. It is time to take back your consciences and to obey your consciences rather than the orders of sin." In our shameful times, we're in need of such a reminder over the past several months as ICE, Border Patrol, and agents of the Department of Homeland Security enforced a policy that separated children from their parents and families, some permanently. There is no federal law mandating the loss of one's child for the act of migrating without the proper paperwork. A policy change effected by the Attorney General of the United States this past spring criminalized these sorts of entries into the country, resulting in forced separations, detentions, traumatized families, and lost children. Deterrence through terror. How does a nation of immigrants with a non-innocent history of separating children from their families, the children of enslaved people sold away from their parents, the children of indigenous people sent to boarding schools and white families, the children of the urban poor relocated to rural areas with new families? How does such a country with a non-innocent history ever imagine that this is a good and noble idea? Where are the calls for acts of conscience? If, as Augustine posited, Aquinas affirmed, as Martin Luther King Jr. and Óscar Romero insisted, an unjust law is no law at all, then what exactly is an unjust policy? In 1969, the National Conference of Catholic Bishops released Human Life in Our Day, their pastoral letter on the sanctity of life and conscience, remembered today only in excerpts for its passages on abortion and contraception, but not for its controversial call for selective conscientious objection, a position they had articulated and disseminated to draft boards and young Catholic men a year earlier. The bishops remembered, quote, "The number of individuals who have suffered imprisonment or have left the country because they felt compelled to follow their conscience rather than the law," end quote. In that same letter, the bishops pleaded for openness in confronting youthful protests. Where are the words of our church today to our Catholic brothers and sisters trying to sort out their responsibilities as people of faith employed in law and border enforcement? If an apostolic nuncio to the United States regards a county clerk who defied a federal order to issue a marriage license to same-sex couples as a laudable example of conscientious objection, where is the counseling to support local and federal government employees who refuse to participate in immigrant roundups, deportations, family separations, and the incarceration of children? How difficult and stressful must it be for those who are immigrants or the children of immigrants, particularly Latinos, to police the southern border, enforcing policies that pit them against their own kin? As a pastor and as a Salvadoran citizen, Romero called on more than the military to reclaim and act according to their individual and collective consciences in order to stop the repression. He called out every sector of Salvadoran society in the name of the gospel to, quote, walk away from the paths of violence and to seek with greater vigor rational solutions through dialogue. He summoned the oligarchy to collaborate with the people and to yield with pleasure that which will give greater peace to the people and peace to your own consciences, namely the land that they possessed, the rightful patrimony of the people. He beckoned those government officials who felt impotent in the face of corruption to either exercise their power or confess that you cannot command and unmask those who are doing the country great harm under your protection. He reproached those in power who colluded to prevent reform, to cease their obstructing, their fomenting of repression, their betrayal to their own people. He appealed to guerrilla groups to abandon violence as a means to a just ends. Born in the shedding of blood, its fruits would not last. He urged popular organizations to, quote, be responsible political forces that act on behalf of the common good of the people and seek change through dialogue and peaceful resolution. He advocated solidarity with those who were poor, yet he acknowledged the power of the campesinos to evangelize others, to act on their own behalf, to contribute to the common good, and to participate as agents in the creation of a just nation. Romero was the pastor of the vulnerable, the indifferent, the collaborators, the perpetrators, and those whose fortunes benefited from the violence. In that role, for 3 years as Archbishop, through his radio broadcast Sunday Mass homilies, Romero had called out all of his people, imploring them to reclaim their consciences, to resist violence, to work towards solutions respectful of human dignity, to assume their obligations to each other and their national common good. He used his Sunday sermons as a means of prophetic resistance, catechesis, and formation of consciences. What do our preachers do today in these shameful times? Romero, theologizing the daily. As representatives of the world's bishops gather in a synod to reflect on and be challenged by young people as church, it comes as no surprise that areas of exploration include the place of digital media. Since Vatican II, the church has explicitly addressed the role of social communication and has increasingly become more fluid and fluent in the ever-changing methods and means that connect people across time and geography and various relationships. I would propose that if we consider Romero's output solely in terms of his Sunday homilies as Archbishop, proportionately, it is fair to say that the depth, reach, and impact of his sermons and how they functioned far exceed the influence of EWTN, Word on Fire, and Fulton Sheen, all rolled into one. By today's standards, one homily would have easily yielded, on average per week, 3 podcasts, 20 plus tweets, 15 Facebook posts, a few blogs embracing a scripture column, a theological update, a catechetical lesson, and commentaries on the issues facing the body politic. Romero was social media incarnate, receiving letters and reading them aloud, conveying the weekly news of the church and the events of the week, all grounded in the gospel, rooted in the daily lived realities of a particular context during an exceedingly dangerous time. He combated the fake news of his day, explicated the complexities of the issues facing his people, situating them within the teachings of the church and its lived realities as articulated in Latin America. He engaged the gospel through a hermeneutic of daily liberation, supporting no political party, yet trusting that the formation of conscience required access to more than just information. It required truthful sources, conduits for dialogue, helpful resources, and spaces where the voices of the voiceless would find expression. Each set of lectionary readings could not stand alone. Through Romero's sermons, they were embedded and implicated in the weekly struggles of the Salvadoran people. He named the dead, the disappeared, the tortured, so that they could not be disembodied, forgotten, or cut off from the community. The community of Aguileras is in great pain, and I want to express my solidarity to the people of this community. Jose Maria Murillo, Anibal Corrada Tejada, Emilio Estrada Alegría, and another unidentified young man were taken from their homes. In another village, Santo Rivas Lemos, Antonio Alas Ocasangre, Fidel Américo González, Efraín Ernesto González, and in another place, Juan Umaña. On Mission Sunday in October of 1977, Romero apologized to his listeners. "Forgive me for the length of time I have spent speaking about all this news. For you see, the church, as she announces the word of God, cannot ignore the concrete reality. If we do not speak out about these events, we run the danger of announcing an ethereal gospel that has no connection to history or to the world. In our own shameful times, how are our dioceses and archdioceses using the power of the easily accessible digital media available today? What did we as church post yesterday and this morning in social media in response to the fake news about the caravan of refugees, many of whom are women and children, fleeing violence at home in search of asylum? What are we preaching from our pulpits as the litany of mismanaged cases of abuse drips excruciatingly slowly, diocese by diocese by diocese? Do our tweets record each deportee, detainee, lost child, those disappeared from our barrios and our pews? Do we tweet daily the name of each life lost to gun violence, especially those of our kids? Chicago, Las Vegas, Parkland High School, Pulse Nightclub. Do our blogs and podcasts and video streams implore our people to examine and inform their consciences before they speak and act in manners detrimental to the dignity of all human life at every stage and in every condition. Are we trusted for our resources? In our shameful time, I cannot imagine that Romero would be a welcome guest. More, a meddlesome presence to be silenced. Romero made the most out of what was accessible in his time to communicate far beyond his reach. And when the Archdiocesan radio transmitter was destroyed in a bombing, he praised those who brought tape recorders to bring the word outside of the cathedral. And he recognized the ingenuity of others who sent out the taped word on shortwave band radios. He noted these as efforts of solidarity, tape recorders that had provided a wonderful service to our ministry. Through his inclusion of correspondences from those who wrote to him, through his encouragement of those who brought tape recorders and used them to spread the message far outside the cathedral, through his groundedness in the daily rhythms and disruptions of life, Romero established the Sunday homily as a collaborative social media network in and through which the community participated in the risky business of bringing about the reign of God. Learning from the street. Any number of friends, acquaintances, and biographers have described Óscar Romero as bookish, and his homilies revealed Romero to be both a careful learner as well as an effective teacher. He used his sermons to educate people, not shying away from complicated issues or the intricacies of theology. Campesinos were vulnerable, but they were not simpletons, and he respected the intelligence of his diverse audience who followed and listened faithfully. He recommended sources from the academy to help make sense of things. I want to inform you about the publication of a document by the National University and the University Simón Cañas, to which other impartial entities in the nation will undoubtedly make reference to, a profound and calm reflection on what is occurring in the news. He knew study was dangerous business. We were informed yesterday at noon that a university student, Oscar Edmundo Bonilla, was arrested. I hope that he has been set free. If not, I ask that he and others be brought before the courts. Because it opened minds and hearts to structural inequities. I received a letter from General Association of Salvadoran University Students asking me to denounce the repression of the campesinos and to draw a light on the lamentable situation of the workers in the factories that have been closed. Romero was aware of the price paid by those who dare to educate others. They placed not only themselves, but their families at risk. Another professor was assassinated, José Abilio Torres Benavides. So far, this year, 9 professors have been assassinated. Professor Agustín Osmin Hernández was arrested by 5 security agents on February 12th at 11:30 in Aguilares. His wife and his community are concerned about him. Hopefully, this news will accelerate his release, or at least move those who have been arrested into the courts. People have expressed their solidarity with Professor Guillermo Galván, whose house was machine-gunned. The body of José Efraín Arevalo Cuellar, who had been arrested on March 9th in San Miguel, was found. There were signs of torture on his body, and he is the son of Professor Efraín Arevalo Ibarra, who disappeared 2 years ago. I have a letter here from his mother, the widow of Professor Ibarra. At the same time, Romero sought counsel from the teachers in las calles, in the streets. He learned from the epistemologies of las madres of the disappeared and labor organizers. He studied the text of las vidas cotidianas, of daily living. His vicar general, Monsignor Ricardo Oreste, tells an illuminating story about Romero, the student of lo cotidiano, the student of the daily. I remember an occasion when he gathered all the great minds of the archdiocese together, canonists and ethicists, moral theologians, pastoralists, canon lawyers. Each and every one of them gave an opinion on what he asked about. And Romero, he took notes for 2 hours. And when the meeting was done, I saw him walking away, and he went down the stairs and he approached a man who was standing there. He looked like a beggar. I thought Romero was going to give him change. But then I overheard him. He asked the man the same questions he had asked the canonists, the ethicists, the theologians, and the pastoralists. That is how Romero listened to the people, in whom he also saw the church. This, for him, was the church of the street. In our shameful times, where do those of us in the academy, in the university, in the seminary, as learners and teachers, where do we stand? Do we fuel inflammatory rhetoric? Do we fail to do the research on the things we share through our social media feeds? Do we dismiss the cries of others, marginalized by language and policies that erase their existence? Do we steal the chanclas of those we accompany and walk off with the profits of our research on those people? Are we chupacabras, snatching the voices of those made voiceless in order to further our own careers? In our teaching, in our learning, in our research, from the vantage point of academia, do we use our bully pulpits as pulpits in the manner of Romero, or are we just bullies protected by privilege? Are we grounded in the lived experiences that demand our accountability to communities made vulnerable by circumstances and history beyond their control? What must those professors have taught or written in order to be in the company of the disappeared, the tortured, the dangerous, those named in the litanies proclaimed week after week by their Archbishop? In our shameful times, as church and nation, we desperately need the witness of a saint who shakes us out of our fear, our complacency, and our indifference. Óscar Romero is one such santo. But are we willing to make the sacrifices and commitments necessary to be shaken to our core, to reclaim our consciences, and to embrace his legacy? If not, then I suspect we will sanitize this martyr to the point of irrelevance. We will hang a fair trade Romero cross on our walls and move on, succumbing to his greatest fear. No, not death, but, quote, I am even more concerned that the reaction and condemnation and protest from people in general has notably decreased. This reality has allowed the repression to continue with greater boldness and license, end quote. Time will tell whether our affirmation of presente in response to the litany of santos y martyrs means that we have truly inherited, embodied, and embraced the legacy of San Óscar Romero, saint of the Universal Church. San Óscar Romero, pray for and with us. Gracias.
fair to say that we avoided the bobblehead scene. No, the hour is late, and I want to bring things together. This panel has literally generated a volcano of emotions and ideas. So let's first of all thank the panelists for these astounding presentations. Just two more little announcements. Many people have participated in the planning of this event, but the hub at the center of all the different spokes that radiate outward is Lupe Ramirez. So please join me in. Finally, I would be remiss, and Lupe would be a little bit angry at me if I didn't remind you to sign up in the sign-up sheet so we have your contact information before you leave. And also stop by the University of Notre Dame Press table here. They have a discount sheet for a very interesting book on health. But thank you all for coming, and thank our panelists once again.